So one of the favorite hobbies of Lahoris used to be, it's no longer the case, that they used to love to breed pigeons. And कबूतर पालने का बहुत शौक होता था लाहौर के लोगों को, अब नहीं है, inner city में. And if you breed pigeons a certain way, you can get the colors that you want, you can get the sizes that you want, you can create various interesting breeds of pigeon. And in much the same way, you can do the same thing with flowers. Many of the flowers that we see are not naturally occurring. The colors that you see amongst many of the flowers have been artificially bred. Roses and many other kinds of roses and many beautiful kinds of tulips, etc. In fact, the Dutch used to be crazy about tulips, so crazy about tulips that in fact they grew so many different kinds that at one time they had a huge bubble of them and then their economy kind of collapsed as a result as well. So we've done all of this ourselves. Here is the map. You can even draw a map of how wolves transformed into all the various breeds of dogs that you see. We have it all mapped out. And who did all of this? It was not Mother Nature who did this. It was human beings. We've done it. We've done it for generations. The roti that you eat is, from the wheat that it comes from, completely been created by us by selecting from wild grass, etc. The corn that you eat, we created. Even the sheep and the goats and the cows that we keep, these are not the normal kinds of chicken and cows and animals that grew in the wild. Over generations, we have bred them in such a way so that they have the trait that we want the most. For example, if we have a cow, we want the cow to give milk. We are going to breed the cows that give more milk and not breed the cows that don't give milk. And in that way, their capacity to give milk will be more and more and more and greater and greater. So we've been doing this for generations. We've been doing this for thousands of years, in fact. Now, what Darwin adds here is simply to say, instead of human beings doing these things, Mother Nature also does these things. What is the evidence behind that? Here is a moth. Moths were originally white, okay? But during the Industrial Revolution, suddenly people started seeing these black moths. They were called peppered moths, right? In England, they used to see them all the time. And then they found out why it was the case that these kinds of moths were developing and the white moths were almost dying out. I mean, naturally, moths are not black, they're white. And so what they found out was that the black moths could better camouflage themselves against polluted backgrounds, making them less likely to be eaten by predators. This shift is a clear example of natural selection in action. So because there was so much, during the Industrial Revolution, there was so much soot going in the air, so much carbon going in the air, and it was blackening the walls, it was blackening the trees. So the moths that were darker were less likely to get eaten by predators. So the darker moths survived and became darker and darker and darker still, and the white moths were dying out. Imagine that. Environmentalists will be shocked, but this has been proven, right? Similarly, you have antibiotic resistance. You know about this? That we've been taking so many antibiotics, etc. Yes, it works. It's very, very good. It gets rid of the bacteria and so on. But interestingly, the bacteria also mutate to be able to counteract that antibiotic. And now you have all these different kinds of bacteria that are antibiotic resistance. So you give an antibiotic, it doesn't die. Then you have to give a different one, it doesn't die. Then you have to take a third one, then it finally dies, etc. because they're becoming more and more resistant to antibiotics. Darwin's finches is a very famous example. These are birds, etc. with a variety of different beaks because they eat different foods. Some would eat seeds, some would eat worms, etc. And this has been documented not only by Charles Darwin, but then by many, many others over the last 150 odd years. So we've seen this as evidence. We also then have what we call the fossil record, okay? And we managed to look at all the layers, the time frames, the layers, and what animals are found in which layers, etc., etc. And we can see in that transitional fossils show intermediate forms between different groups demonstrating gradual evolutionary change, right? And we see stratification. What we mean by that is that fossils are found in layers of rock with simpler organisms in older layers and more complex organisms in newer layers, reflecting gradual change over time. Okay, so the deeper you go in the fossil record, the deeper you go in the earth, in the stone, etc., in the mud and so on, the kind of organisms that you find are simpler and simpler and simpler. And as you come up, you find more and more complex kind of organisms, hence proving that life has been evolving from the simple form to the more complex form over time. Now many people say, well, sir, okay, but what about the missing links in the fossil record? And this is one of the big criticisms of, if you watch social media, of Darwinism. Okay, oh, you're not able to show all the fossils of all the animals. There are many animals without fossils. What's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is very obvious. That when an animal dies, it has to be buried immediately. If it's sitting around on the surface, it's going to decompose on the surface. And not only does it have to be rapidly buried, where it is buried, there have to be very low oxygen levels. Because if there's oxygen, then what will happen is that the bones, the body will decompose. So to prevent the decomposition of the bones, body, etc., and to get that fossil, it has to be buried immediately, there has to be low oxygen levels, etc. And many animals and plants, of course, have soft bodies only, and they decompose very rapidly without leaving any things that will leave a fossil record, etc., because they are harder things. So that also happens. So you have to have a very specific kind of organism and also burial in order to get that fossil. Second, only a fraction of the Earth's surface has really been explored. So obviously you have to go somewhere where nobody is going to mind you digging up the Earth and then finding things from within it. So tiny fraction of the Earth really has been explored for the fossil record. And that's for that simple reason the number of fossils that we have is obviously going to be limited. The third issue is that geological processes also occur and they destroy fossils. You know that the Earth is always moving, tectonic plates are moving, the layers of the Earth are moving, not very quickly, don't worry, it's not going to move from under your foot, but it's moving very slowly. Sometimes it moves a little faster as well, that's when we get an earthquake, etc. So all of these things are causing geological erosion, in which case, of course, fossils get destroyed as well. It's not like the process is such that you get this perfect preservation of everything that ever lived, and therefore then there are missing links, etc. That's completely misunderstanding what the fossil record says. So even though the record is incomplete, what do you see? You see numerous fossils that indicate transitional forms. That is, between one species and another species, you see this fossil and it looks like part of one species, but it also looks like part of another species, and you're like, this is something in the middle. It no longer exists, by the way. That animal in the middle doesn't exist. But the animals that existed, on the sides do exist. So why is this the case? This is also the case because people don't realize or don't understand that where natural selection is operating, extinction is also operating. So on the one hand, you have new animals being created, but on the other hand, you have animals that are dying out. Many of the animals that are transiting, the transitory forms, they die out, they become extinct. So both processes are at work simultaneously. New things are being created by nature, old things are being destroyed by nature, and so on. So extinction is actually a very central process to understand how natural selection works. Then we have evidence from comparative anatomy. This is absolutely fascinating because what you discover is that the structures of very different animals, the bone structures of these animals, is actually very similar. You look over here and you see one animal, and what do you see? You see almost like a hand. You see another animal and the same limbs are like this. You see a third animal and the limbs are like this. You see a fourth one, that's a human hand. You see the limbs are like this. This is the same hand over here. This is a bat, by the way. But you see that the bat, it's not Batman, but it's a bat. And you see it's in a wing. It's inside a wing. So the wing of the bat is really the hand of human beings. Imagine that. All of them are the same. This is a bird, as you can see, right? This is a human. This is a horse with a hoof, right? Even the hoof is the same bones, basically, fused together, etc. So when we see that the bone structure we have is slightly different, etc., but roughly the same kind of structures exist in loads and loads of animals. The same organs exist in loads and loads of animals. What you understand is that animals are connected to each other. Otherwise, they would have completely different bone structures, but they don't. They don't have completely different bone structures. They have rib cages, and they have lungs, and they have eyes, and ears, and noses, and mouths, and ears, or more or less the same, sort of nervous system that we have. Mammals share the same kind of nervous system, etc. And you also see what are called vestigial structures. That is, structures that have lost their original purpose. They are in us, they exist within us, but they serve no function for us, right? They're useless for us today, but they were at some level of the evolutionary ladder, they used to be useful for the animal that was our great ancestor. But now as a human animal, the way we have evolved, we don't need those anymore. Like for example, if you look at my stomach, there's a scar over here. Why is there a scar over here? Because my appendix got taken out. Why did my appendix get taken out? Because it got kharab. Did it affect me in any particular way? No. It used to be a useful organ before, a long time ago. It's no longer a useful organ. I can live a perfectly good life without my appendix. I don't need it. It's just an extra organ sitting around over there. I never even need it. I got my tonsils removed when I was about 17. I've never needed it, no problem. I can exist without tonsils. Maybe I needed them when I was young, but I no longer need them. So we have lots of parts of our body that exist that don't really do anything as such, but they are vestigial structures that continue to exist from a bygone period when we needed them and we no longer need them. Then we have evidence from embryology. This is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Why? Because you look at different animals, and in embryonic form, here is one animal, here is another one, here is another one, here is another one, another one, another one, another one, another one. They're in vertical rows. But you look at the horizontal row and you look at the early shape of the animal as a fetus, etc., and you discover they're all the same. And one of these animals, interestingly, is a human being. Okay, this is a pig, etc. This is a fish. This is like, I don't know, some weird salamander, etc. What is going on? In fact, if you look at the human animal, when we are very small, we have a tail. Yes, we have a tail, which gradually just finishes, and then we don't have a tail anymore. By the way, sometimes kids are born with a tail. I don't know if you know this. It's very tiny, etc. This is also an aberration, etc. Right? Why? Because, yeah, there was a time when we had, in embryonic form, we have the tail. And so this is, I mean, it's mind-blowing, isn't it? That in embryonic form, all the animals are actually pretty similar, but then something happens as they grow up and they develop into completely different animals altogether. It's fascinating. So for example, the embryos of fish, birds and mammals all have pharyngeal slits, which in fish develop into gills, and in mammals into parts of the ear and throat. So my ear and throat is made of the same thing that in fish becomes the gills with which they are able to convert the oxygen in the water. They're able to breathe inside the water. Imagine, so you're breathing with this. Isn't that fascinating? Makes you think about Aquaman, doesn't it? So all vertebrate embryos, from humans to chickens to fish, have a tail during early development. Oh my God! Even if that tail does not appear in the fully developed organism. Then we have evidence from biogeography. Oh, this is fascinating stuff, okay? There was a long time ago, do you know that all the landmass of the world was basically joined together? I'm sure you knew this, right? And you can see here is Antarctica, here is Australia, here is India, Africa, South America, and so on. They were all joined together, North America over here, and so on and so forth, etc. So what they discovered was they're actually able to trace out the flora and fauna as well as animals and how they moved. So the animals that were over here, the fossils of these animals are found along the same axis where South America joined with Africa. And this animal you find, for example, in these areas of India, Africa and Antarctica that were joined together. This was their habitat. Similarly, with this animal over here, this plant over here, which is found along this particular streak, it lines up perfectly, as well as over here. It lines up perfectly. This cannot be a coincidence. This has to be the case that when these continents were connected, the animals could easily move across, or when the continents were connected, the same kind of plants, etc., were in the same kind of atmospheric condition or climatic conditions. So once the continents then got removed, you saw the same thing over here as you did across the bloody Atlantic Ocean. How did that happen? That happened because of this particular reason. So this is another incredible evidence for evolution. And you have distribution. The distribution of the species shows the evidence for evolution. Island species often resemble those on the nearest mainland, suggesting they evolved from common ancestors. The diverse species of finches on the Galapagos Islands are famous examples. So if you have an island just off the coast of some bigger continent, the island is likely to have species that are closely connected, not identical necessarily, but closely connected to whatever continent it exists near. This can't be a coincidence. And you have convergent evolution. What is that? Species in similar environments on different continents often evolve similar adaptations despite not being closely related, such as the similar body shapes of sharks, dolphins, both adapted to life in water. So all of this is the same evidence. Then, of course, we have genetic evidence. What is that? When DNA was, of course, discovered, we are able to map out how closely one animal relates to another animal by just looking at their DNA composition. And if evolution was untrue, it would have been extremely unlikely that our DNA would essentially be the same. We have the same building blocks. It's like the Lego of life. Just like you build with Lego, you build a house. The Lego we are built of is in every cell of our body, and it's DNA. And the same Lego is in that bloody cockroach that I killed this morning. Okay, the same Lego is in the chipkili that I killed last night. Okay, this makes me sound like a bit of a killer, but you get the picture. They are all made of the same stuff. How is that? That's mind-blowing. That's absolutely mind-blowing. So humans and chimpanzees share approximately 98 to 99% of their genetic material. Some people maybe in lumps have even more than 99%. Who knows? That's just a joke. But you get the picture. We have closely related cousins, animals that are very close to us genetically and animals that are very far away from us genetically. It boggles my mind to think that a banana is related to me. How is this possible? A fruit is related to me. Grass is, that tree outside is related to me somehow or the other. All of organic life, it's the most beautiful idea you can think of, is related to each other. All of it flows out of a common ancestor. There's one source from which everything flows out, including that banana that you ate this morning and the person who ate the banana. They all came from the same source of life. It's mind-blowing, again. And then you have pseudogenetics, non-functional sections of DNA that were once functional in ancestral species, serving as a molecular record of evolutionary change. So just like you have organs in your body that you no longer require or use, you have DNA in your body that you no longer require or use as well. You have extra DNA sitting around, pseudogenes they're called. They're just pseudo ones because they're not doing anything. And they used to do something in the past. They served some function in the past, but they're just sitting there now doing nothing. Imagine that. And then you have the concept of a molecular clock. The consistent rate of genetic mutations can be used to estimate the time when two species diverged from common ancestors. Yes, so you can actually measure by looking at genetics how far back, how many generations back you would have to go in order for the genetic diversification to be achieved, whatever that genetic diversification is. And scientists have been able to map it out. Oh my God, this is mind-blowing stuff. They map it out. Okay, you know, this gene departed from this gene about 20,000 years ago, and that gene came out of this one about 50,000 years ago, and so on and so forth. And they have a whole system they've worked out in which they can actually run that entire thing. And then you have a whole branch now of science based on this, which is called synthetic morphology. I know that sounds like a mouthful. Morph just means shape. Morphology means the science of shape, the study of shape. Synthetic means done by human beings, right? So synthetic morphology is what? Creating new forms and species of life. Yes, scientists are able to create weird new kinds of things. Like, for example, when I was growing up, we used to watch this movie of the human fly, this guy who becomes he tries to create this transporting machine, and accidentally when he goes in the transporting machine, a fly also goes in. And when he comes out from the other side of the transporting machine, his DNA and the fly's DNA get mixed up, so he becomes like a human fly. Scary sort of thing. But can I tell you that it's true, in the sense that one of my wife's cousin, who's a PhD in genetics, I asked him, I said, yeah, what was your PhD on? What did lab work did you do? What kind of work did you do? He says, yeah, we used to work with flies. I said, what did you do with flies? Yeah, we used to just change around their DNA just to see what would happen. I said, then what would happen? He said, yeah, some would be born with their heads in the middle and their stomachs up here. Others would be born with 4 wings. Some would be born without legs. Some would be... I said, well, did they survive? He said, no, they don't survive. They don't live, etc. because that particular genetic combination is not, viable, naturally viable, etc. But yeah, we just tinker around with DNA to create these monstrosities that never survive. Scientists are doing this all the time. Like, for example, I just did a Google search and I got this out for you. Synthetic yeast genome project creates strain with over 50% synthetic DNA. So half the DNA has just been coded by the scientist sitting there. You know what, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to put this in, I'm going to put that out, etc. Imagine that. And so they created yeast. Over here you see scientists discover a new way to make species. You can read this article. And over here scientists were trying to save one fish and accidentally created another fish. Yeah, they created their own fish. You can create your own flies, you can create your own fish, and so on. Or up to, you might be thinking about this in science fiction, but you can identify even, I want my son to have blue eyes. What kind of genes do I need for them to have blue eyes and green eyes and so on? That can be mapped out. The human genome, of course, has been mapped out. So, of course, there's a huge ethical debate about whether, you should be allowed to do something of that sort, that you should be allowed to play with genes and play with nature and synthetically say, I want my son to have legs like Usain Bolt or something, etc., right? I mean, it would not be right. Charles Darwin, when he proposed evolution by natural selection, that's over 150 years ago, 160, 70 years ago. It's a long, long time ago, okay, long. He himself revised his theory like 7, 8 times and came out with the same book 8 times. Origin of the Species, edition 1, edition 2, edition 3. And every time he would change a few things and make it better as new discoveries were happening. That was what he was doing. It was groundbreaking at the time, but doesn't mean it was all correct, because the state of knowledge at that time was actually very primitive. But do you think that bas wahin pe khadi hui thi theory? Of course not. Over the last 150 years, people have been testing his hypotheses and developing new ones and so on. So many people, what they do is, they talk about Darwin and they talk about where he was wrong, and then that leaves you with the impression that, oh, he made mistakes. But of course, other scientists came along and said, he was right about this, but he wasn't right about this. So what were the things he was right about, and what were the things he was wrong about that, later were improved? So the first and most important thing is, of course, Darwin had no understanding of DNA. DNA simply had not been discovered. Nobody knew what the hell DNA was, okay? Darwin believed, in fact, his theory was wrong. His wrong theory was that tiny particles called gemmules were shed by all cells of the body and collected in the reproductive organs. This is called pangenesis, pan because it's everywhere. Genesis means to create. So every cell in my body is creating something or the other. The eyes are creating some sort of cell for the eyes, and all of it goes into my reproductive organ. And then the gemmules blended from both parents, leading to blended inheritance. Okay, so if I have, let's say, tall legs and my wife, if I'm tall and my wife is short, he thought that my children will be the average between the two. Okay, so if I'm 5'11" and my wife is 5'3", then you can do the math and you can figure out that my children should be maybe 5'5", 5'6", or something, right? But that's wrong. He thought that would be the case. That's wrong. In fact, this theory of blended inheritance actually makes it harder for Darwin to prove his theory. Because if you had blended inheritance, it would actually dilute the beneficial traits over generations, making it harder for natural selection to work effectively, because everything would average out. If everything averages out, then everybody should more or less become the same over many, many generations. And that's not what evolution by natural selection is saying. In evolution by natural selection is saying that the species will diversify. So how will diversification occur if pangenesis is the case? So he was wrong. This is a wrong theory. It's wrong both because gemmules don't exist. What exists is DNA. Not every cell of your body contributes to whatever pangenesis and all this stuff. Okay, it's in the DNA. Yes, our DNA is in every cell, but the DNA in every cell is the same. Okay, so the discovery of mutations and the role of DNA showed that variation comes from genetic, mutation, recombination, gene flow, and so many other things, etc. So that is what nature then acts upon. So if I am 5'11" and my wife is 5'3", what will happen is that either my children will be around 5'11" or they will be around 5'3". They will not average out in the middle. Either they'll get her genes or they'll get my genes. Okay, so Darwin didn't understand. He thought average ho jayega. It's not the case. So let's say if I'm African American and my wife is Chinese or something, one or the other gene is going to be dominant and the other gene is going to be recessive. Okay, that's what we learned. Who taught us that? This is the guy, Mendel. Gregor Mendel, who was also a father, etc., he was a priest. He worked on plants and he tried to understand. He took a very specific plant and he ran this beautiful experiment in which he cross-fertilized plants to see whether they would grow tall or short. And what he discovered is that three times out of 4 they would grow tall and 1 times out of 4 they would grow short. And that was the exact combination. He ran that experiment jitni marzi dafa and the exact same number came out, the exact same proportion, 3:1, 3:1, 3:1, 3:1. And he couldn't understand. It didn't that the cross-fertilization didn't result in the new plant being averaging out. It resulted either in a tall plant or in a short one in a certain combination. And that combination, of course, indicated the degree of recessiveness and dominance of either of the plant's genes. So, poor guy's discovery, he discovered it a long time ago in the 19th century, in the 1860s or whatever. किसी ने लिफ्ट ही नहीं कराई बेचारे को, उसकी theory को भी. One of the reasons was that it was a very specific experiment on a very specific kind of plant, difficult to reproduce that experiment with other organisms and other kinds of plants and animals and so on. So people just kind of forgot about it till, of course, Darwin's theory came about. And then they started to think about Darwin's idea of pangenesis and gemmules and the rest of it. And then, of course, they discovered genetics and they discovered Mendel was right all along. He was the man. And anyway, so when genetics were discovered, they understood why Mendel was correct. Mendel was right, but they couldn't figure out why he was right. And now finally they were able to work out he is right. And that actually created what we call the modern synthesis, in which Darwin's theory of evolution is united with Mendelian genetics, indicating that the two things will not average out, the two genes will not average out, but one will be dominant, the other will be recessive. Okay? Then there was the idea, Darwin's idea, that evolution occurs not just slowly and gradually, but it occurs constantly at a given rate. Okay? Constantly there is a certain amount of change over time. But as the fossil record began to grow bigger and bigger, not in Darwin's time, but afterwards, as it continued to grow, as new fossils were discovered, they showed that in certain places there were abrupt explosions, like the Cambrian explosion and so on. And in other places, the fossil record would go for thousands of years without any significant change at all. The same animals for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years would go on, and then suddenly there would be a very big change. So what was this? This was then solved in the 1970s by Niels Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, who proposed the theory of punctuated equilibrium. Okay, so punctuated equilibrium means that the system would go into an equilibrium, into what they would call stasis, where everything would stay the same, there would be no significant evolution, and then something would happen, maybe like an ice age or maybe something else, climatic changes, etc., global warming, something or the other. We know that that has happened in history, and boom, everything would then undergo a sudden transformation, because the climate of that continent or of the globe would undergo a massive transformation, which would cause a huge change in the entire way in which everything functioned. One very big example of that, although that's not caused by nature, well, in a certain sense it is when that gigantic meteorite struck near the Gulf of Mexico. You know, there was a gigantic meteorite that struck millions of years ago. It was huge, it was massive, it was like a nuclear bomb, and it caused a huge cloud and acid rain and the most horrific conditions that you can imagine. It was like World War III, and it caused the dinosaurs to die out. And because the dinosaurs died out, then the smaller mammalian creatures basically could come out from under the shadow of these gigantic dinosaurs, because they used to dominate the globe. They used to dominate all forms of life. If it were not for that asteroid, the changes brought about by that asteroid hitting and the extinction of the dinosaurs caused a boom, a sudden new change in the equilibrium that existed, and new animals came to the fore and to the forefront. Punctuated equilibrium. Species often remain stable for long periods with significant evolutionary changes occurring rapidly in relatively short bursts. So it's not the case that there's constant evolution. In fact, there's stasis, 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 and boom, change, stasis, stasis, boom, change, and forward. Right? It's like Hegelian dialectics. I'll explain that later. This pattern better explains the fossil record while still being compatible with natural selection. So this is a huge advance made in the 1970s. Then Darwin was quite concerned about the altruistic behavior of what we call sterile worker bees. Now there are bees that are male bees, and they're worker bees, and they don't reproduce, right? They just work and work and work, and then they die. Kind of sounds like married men, but they work and work and work, and then they die. And Darwin needed to figure out why do these kinds of bees exist? Because their whole life is altruistic in the sense that they don't reproduce at all. It's the queen bee that reproduces, and they just work to get the honey, etc., and then they die. So what is going on over here? So he came up with the theory of group selection, where traits beneficial to the survival of a group might evolve even if they didn't benefit individuals. So in the first instance, he was talking about survival of the fittest in nature of the individual traits within species as well as between species, etc. But now he said, no, there might also be group selection. So we might work together to make sure that our group survives against that other group. William D. Hamilton developed the theory in the 60s of kin selection and inclusive fitness, which set the record straight with respect to this matter. He said altruistic behavior can evolve by increasing the reproductive success of relatives who share many of the altruistic genes. And in this way, he in fact has a very sophisticated formula to explain how this entire situation works. Then Darwin also posited that the age of the earth has to be very, very old. He thought that it's hundreds of millions of years old. But the problem was that the scientists in his day, especially Lord Kelvin, they understood cooling, right? They understood how the earth cools, and on the basis of how hot the earth used to be and how it has cooled over time, they came up with the calculation that the earth was only 20 to 40 million years old. If the earth was 20 to 40 million years old, according to the geologists and others and physicists who were looking into this matter, who were the specialists in this, then evolution simply didn't have enough time. 20 million years was not enough time according to Darwin's theory, right? This is the mathematical problem of Darwin's evolution. Darwin said, no, you have to be wrong. It has to be hundreds of millions. They were like, no, it's 20 to 40 million years. It's zyada nahi. Who was right? Not only was Darwin right, Darwin was so right that when they discovered in the early 20th century radioactive decay, they could judge the age of the earth by looking at radioactive activity. And they discovered, not only are you wrong, Mr. Kelvin and all the other scientists who were supporting him, 20 to 40 million to hai hi nahi. Even Mr. Darwin with hundreds of millions of years is wrong. In fact, the earth is 4.5 billion years old. Oh my God, that is incredible also because the universe itself is considered to be 13.8 billion years old. So Darwin turned out to be right. More than enough time for evolution, okay? Although he also underestimated how old the earth is. Then we had allopatric speciation. Now Darwin, when he was talking about species, he didn't have a very exact definition of species. Neither did it really matter to him what the exact definition is, because all he was looking at was the variation in nature, right? But as things went on, scientists developed the idea that a species is said to be something that cannot reproduce with something else. So if you are two separate species, if the two cannot reproduce, either they cannot physically reproduce, or even if they physically reproduce, the offspring will not survive. Now, turns out, so that was the definition that they made between one species and another species. Now, it turns out that it's way more complicated than that. There are way more complications than that. There are species that can and cannot reproduce and so on, and sometimes they can reproduce and sometimes they don't reproduce and blah, blah, blah. It's very complicated. But nonetheless, this was the new definition that was introduced. So Darwin's theory, in Darwin's theory, species is just any variation is what he meant by species. But later on, Ernest Mayr developed a more detailed understanding of speciation, particularly allopatric speciation, where populations become geographically isolated and evolve separately. So this was a further development of his science, that we are able to now identify what makes a species and separable from others, etc. Right? Then you have another process in addition to natural selection, which is called sexual selection. Darwin also, but many others, were concerned about why peacocks, male peacocks, were so beautiful. Okay? Female peacocks are not beautiful. Male peacocks are beautiful. Look at that beautiful tail. Okay? Females don't have that tail. You know this, right? So why do they have this? And when they open their tail, you've seen a peacock, it looks absolutely divine. Looks beautiful, right? So can you imagine carrying around a tail like this and trying to outrun other animals that are trying to eat you? I mean, this does not make any evolutionary sense whatsoever, right? To have a tail that's that big, you would not be able to run, you would not be able to fight, any animal would grab you by the tail and that would be the end of your story. So why do they have it? So the reason was that this tail is completely maladaptive in terms of survival. But it is very, very useful as far as reproduction is concerned, because the male, when he would come and he would open his tail, and if he had a beautiful tail, then the female would say, okay, I'm ready to mate with you. But otherwise, if you didn't have a beautiful tail, nothing doing. Ronald Fisher and Jeffrey Miller explained how sexual selection can drive the evolution of extravagant traits by influencing reproductive success independent of survival benefits. This is called runaway selection. Okay, so you are selecting, but it's not, nature is selecting, and actually it's not nature that's selecting, it's the female sex that is selecting on the basis of traits that they find attractive, and those traits are not necessarily the ones that make that species or animal, etc., good at survival, but it just makes them beautiful enough such that that particular thing happens. So sexual selection is very, 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 in fact, important. It's not natural. It is a kind of natural selection, but it's very different. Sexual selection is a type of natural selection that arises from differences in reproductive success due to variations in ability to obtain mates. It can result in the evolution of traits that improve mating success, but may not necessarily improve survival. So take, for example, these antlers, right? They have these massive antlers. What purpose do they serve? Nothing at all. There's no purpose as far as their survival is concerned. But they're absolutely beautiful and gorgeous. They look absolutely amazing. It's like the peacock's feathers, etc., right? And there's intrasexual selection, which is competition between members of the same sex. Mostly men fight it out with each other for access to mates. So this happens amongst, human beings as well. Okay, don't go there, don't look at her, she's mine, okay, I'm going to beat you up, etc., etc. And traits like large size, antlers, or combat abilities evolve in response to these pressures. So why is, fashion and music with videos and all this, why is this so popular? Precisely because the males are showing those traits that they think women will find attractive. And then there is intersexual selection. What is that? Preference by one sex, often females, for certain traits in mates, leading to the evolution of features like elaborate plumages, songs, or courtship behavior, etc. If you don't know how to play the game, then you're not going to win in the courtship game, right? Okay, then we have genetic drift. What is that? Genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies in a population due to chance events, especially in small populations. Like, for example, I said natural disaster can cause a big level extinction event, which can mean that genetic variation in that species can die out. That's what happened with the dinosaurs. That, by the way, is also happening to the poor cheetah. Okay? If the population size of a given species is small, in a small area, volcanic eruption occurs, half the population is destroyed, half the genetic variation is destroyed. That makes that particular animal weak. This is called a bottleneck effect. When a population is drastically reduced in size due to natural disasters, the survivor's genetic pool may be unrepresentative of the original population. The cheetah population has reduced genetic diversity, making them more susceptible to disease and genetic abnormalities. Okay? Genetic diversity, of course, very, very important to having strong genes. And you also have what's called the founder effect. This is very interesting, that when a small group of individuals breaks away from a larger population to colonize a new area, they may carry a limited gene pool which can lead to evolutionary divergences. So, for example, if I go and I create a new colony somewhere, everybody on that island in that colony is going to be related to me and my wife, obviously. And therefore, the genetic pool over there is going to be actually less than the genetic pool from where I came. That's called the founder effect. Okay? And we have observed this in plants, in animals, in human beings, everywhere. This is scientifically verifiable. Then we have this thing called gene flow or gene migration. What happens is that gene flow can occur when an animal or even a plant, etc., or a seed, etc., is able to go from one habitat to another. Gene flow occurs when individuals from one population migrate into another and then interbreed over there. Gene flow leads to genetic homogenization and can counteract the effects of natural selection. In other words, if a particular population is isolated and therefore is evolving in a different direction, one animal comes there, it breeds over there, and because of that it brings back the genes from which that particular population, the gene that did not exist in that particular population. And suddenly that gene also begins to grow, and if that gene begins to grow, it can change the entire equilibrium of that particular island. Amazing, isn't it? The migration of individuals between populations of plants carried by wind or animals can introduce new genetic material and restore diversity in isolated populations. Here's the reference, etc. All of this is basically referenced in scientific work. Then you have gene mutation. Okay, everybody loves X-Men and mutants and so on, right? You are already familiar with the idea of gene mutation, and there's a new serial out in which women suddenly get the power to electrocute anybody, etc. I don't know, it's on Netflix if you've seen it or not. So mutations are changes in the DNA sequence of an organism's genome. They are the ultimate source of all genetic variation and provide the raw material upon which other mechanisms like natural selection act. This mutation can occur all the time. By the way, mutations can be beneficial, they can be neutral, and they can also be harmful. Doesn't mean all mutations are good. Mutations can be very bad. Mostly they are bad, and mostly they're not necessarily very good. Only beneficial mutations are likely to survive, because if the mutation is not good, then that organism is not going to be a good functioning organism. It's not going to be, might not be able to reproduce, might not be able to eat, might not be able to think, might not be able to function, might not be able to walk, might not be able to do a lot of things. So we know about a lot of genetic diseases that exist. We call them diseases, etc. But we know they're just genetic mutations that cause those people to not have certain traits that the majority of people have. Now here's an interesting mutation. This is a mutation in the CCR5 gene in humans, and what it does is it was first discovered amongst African sex workers, and these people with this particular mutation are completely immune to HIV and AIDS. They cannot get HIV. You can inject them with HIV and their body will just spit it out like it's nothing. Imagine that. So that's another example of a mutation. So genes can change by several things: insertions, deletions, chromosomal changes, and so on and so forth, etc. Many different kinds of mutations that we're still studying. Isn't this fascinating that there are women in the world jinko HIV effect nahi karte? Of course, there's huge studies now being done on them. How can we create that same genetic modification in everybody else so that we can solve the AIDS pandemic? It's not so simple. Can't be done. Then we have what's called non-random mating. Mating is not just random. It's not just everybody, is a purely, equal and something of that sort. No, of course not. Non-random mating occurs when individuals choose mates based on certain traits or genetic similarities or differences. Of course, people with certain features will be preferred. Men who are often taller will be preferred, so forth. Athletic builds, blah, blah, blah. All of these things, right? So we have two kinds of non-random mating: negative assortative and positive assortative. Assort to sort things out, right? So negative assortative mating occurs when individuals prefer to mate with those who are different from them, right? Genetically different from them. We are talking about genetic differences, right? You look very different, you are very different, your genetic makeup is very different. Anyway, positive assortative means mating occurs when individuals prefer those who are similar to them, okay? I'm a Pakistani, I want to marry a Pakistani, she also has to be Lahori, she has to be Punjabi, and she has to be from the same neighborhood as me, and so on and so forth. In fact, that is what we also refer to as inbreeding. So inbreeding is mating between closely related individuals. This increases the frequency of recessive genetic disorders within a population. This is very bad. It's very, very, very bad for your gene pool, for your children, etc. This can lead to harmful genetic traits becoming more common due to lack of genetic diversity. And look at what's happening in Pakistan. This is cousin marriages in South Asia. Okay, 61% cousin marriages in Balochistan, 64% current cousin marriages in Sindh, 56% marriages in Punjab are cousin marriages. What is this? 56% here, 48% here, 50% here, 41% here, and so on. We have the highest rate of cousin marriages. Why are we going against our genetics? Because, of course, we have a highly segregated society in which men are not allowed to meet women. Most of the time, we marry our first, second, third cousins. We marry within the family. It's got nothing to do with genetics. It also has to do with families sort of keeping wealth within themselves. It has to do with the biradari system, of course, the Zaat and biradari system. And I don't know if you know, but we have a very, very high incidence of thalassemia in this country, which is a blood disorder. We have many, many genetic problems in Pakistan because of cousin marriages. Many, many. We don't even want to acknowledge it because we don't want to, call this into question because it's such an old tradition. We've been doing it. Some of your parents might be cousins, your grandparents might be cousins, their grandparents might be cousins. And if I say it's really bad for you and your family, etc., you'll feel a little bad about it. Epigenetics, another very interesting thing that comes out of this incredible theory of Darwin. Epigenetics means heritable changes in genes expression that do not involve alterations in the DNA sequence. DNA remains the same, but still, somehow or the other, your genes are able to remember things, environmental factors that have happened to you. They can remember them. While epigenetics changes are typically get reversed or reset every time a new generation is born, some of them last over generations. They can last over generations. The biggest example of that is called prenatal famine exposure. So what happens is, if women have been, or if a generation of people has been exposed to famine, and really bad, drastic famine like the Ethiopian famine, like the Bengal famine, etc., your genes carry the imprint of that famine. In fact, what happens is that the health of subsequent generations is badly impacted by that. They are born basically mentally challenged as a consequence of a famine that may have occurred 20, 30, 40, 50, even 100 years ago. It continues down the line into your line. Imagine that. That is how terrible famines are, that your epigenetics, epi means above, sort of genetics, can carry the memory of those famines that Mr. Churchill caused in India. Then finally, you have directional, stabilizing, disruptive, and balancing selection. What are those? Those are also very interesting. Let's first look at directional selection. It favors individuals with traits at one extreme of the phenotypic range. So that's the normal kind of evolution. So people will think that this is a snake, and the predator will not attack this because it would think it's a snake, and it doesn't want to attack a snake. If it has a small tail, then it will attack it, and so therefore those chipkilis with small tails, short tails over here, long tails over here, will gradually die out, and the population of chipkilis, as you can see, is moving in this direction. This is called directional selection. Over time, chipkilis will be expected to have longer and longer tails, etc. Okay? Then there is stabilizing selection. In stabilizing selection, the extremes of both things are attacked by other animals, predators, etc., or nature even. So for example, if the tail is too short or if the tail is too long, in both extremes the cat cannot manage. A short tail messes up the cat's balance. The tail is very important for balance. If you ever see a cheetah, it has a beautiful tail, and when it turns, the tail, which is a heavy tail, the tail also, kind of moves with that, morphs with that turn, with the gravity, and the cheetah is therefore able to take these extremely tight turns, balancing itself with the tail. Amazing. Kya baat hai. If it had a very short tail and it tried to turn that fast, what would happen? It would flip over, it would fall over, it would not manage to turn so quickly. But if the tail is too long, then of course, what will happen is that it will be too heavy, he might not get that kind of acceleration, predator might catch the tail, etc. So both sides become, both short tails, long tails will be eaten up, and so the cheetah will more and more be focused in this particular range of having a medium tail. Then there's a third thing called disruptive selection. Disruptive selection occurs when the middle part gets attacked by predators or by nature. It can be predators or it can be nature, etc. So either you can have a very short tail or you can have a very long one, but you can't have a middle one. Here, middle one was the best. Here, long or short is better. Short tails help keep predators from catching you on the ground. Long tails are good for balance in the trees. Medium tails don't help anybody, neither on the ground nor on the trees. They're completely useless. Right? So it depends on the animal and the predator and the environment. All of these things matter, and that tells us what happens. And finally, balancing selection is that if there are too many of one type of a particular animal, that type is more likely to get hunted, preyed upon, killed, etc., or just die out from nature, etc., than the entire genetic diversity. Selection is a type of natural selection that maintains genetic diversity in a population by favoring individuals with different phenotypes. Okay, so if you have a different phenotype, that's the one that's going to survive. Like, for example, if you're really super exotic looking, very different from everybody else, you're likely to survive, but that might be a consequence of sexual selection or might be a consequence of some other kind of predatory behavior or natural behavior and so on, right? So this is how all of this is maintained. So finally, to conclude, a picture that you have to take, Darwin laid the foundation for evolutionary biology. The man was a genius, and he really changed the way we think about life fundamentally. He wasn't right about everything, but the main thing that he set us down the course of was correct. His theory has been improved over time with discoveries in genetics, paleontology, and evolutionary biology. Today, biologists recognize a variety of mechanisms that drive evolutionary change. So, evolution by natural selection today is considered one evolutionary mechanism. I've already told you the others. What were they? The other ones are genetic drift is another kind of natural selection. Gene flow is another kind of natural selection. Mutation is another, sexual selection is another, non-random mating is another, epigenetics is another, directional, stabilizing, disruptive, and balancing selection is yet another. Those are at least 8, 9 over there, and there are others that people are thinking about. But he set the ball rolling in the right direction. That all of this is basically a consequence of how the organism is able to survive in and reproduce in a given circumstance. That's what he got right. That determines how nature then diversifies, the development of species, their extinction, their survival. All of this is deeply related to how the entire system of nature functions. So in that regard, all these advances in science are a result of this man's pioneering work, which set humanity on the right path as far as understanding nature and evolution is concerned.